our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. This week, we're going to look at obfuscation. It's a fancy term, and that's kind of the point. We'll talk about how newsmakers use it sometimes to be deceptive. And then, generative AI is affecting many areas of life, but one that's quite important right now is elections, as the technology has made it trivially easy to create disinformation that's already disrupted the democratic process all over the world. My guest and I talk about what experts and ordinary people are afraid of as people embrace these new tools. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Before I hop in, I wanted to thank Peter S. Peter took the time to write into me at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com with a great thought about the podcast. I really appreciate it when people take the time to let me know what does and doesn't work for them. I hope you'll consider reaching out at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com or leaving a comment with a review on your favorite podcast app. And now, let's dig in. Obfuscation. Don't let the fancy term fool you. Obfuscation isn't some rare linguistic delicacy. It's a common tactic for newsmakers who want to get away with something, and sometimes an unfortunate communication problem that doesn't mean to harm but still does. Basically, obfuscation is the art of using complex, confusing, or misleading language to hide the truth or make something seem a lot more important than it actually is. Think of obfuscation as the verbal equivalent of a magician's smoke and mirrors. It's designed to divert your attention away from what's really happening and often leaving you more confused than informed. And unfortunately, this tactic is super common in political discourse, particularly at a national level where lots of politicians have Ivy League law degrees. You may have noticed that lawyers are not often known for their clear language. Let's take a trip back in time for this week's warm-up.
And I do think that...
Oh, yes, they have.
Have we the names and of the people?
I've discussed this matter with the members of the committee. I've also discussed with the members of the committee the question of communist infiltration of atomic and hydrogen bomb plants. I felt that was, I think, even more important than this infiltration at Monmouth.
What did you hear in there that might be unclear? Picture the 1950s, and the Cold War is at its height in the United States, and the fear of communism is everywhere in American society. Enter Joseph McCarthy, a senator and a figure you might remember from your history books. He launched a series of investigations into alleged communist infiltration of American institutions, using what we now recognize as really classic obfuscation tactics. McCarthy's approach was really kind of summarized by aggressive rhetoric and vague accusations, often without any evidence behind them. He'd brand individuals as communists based on innuendo rather than on facts, and he'd use terms like subversive and un-American liberally, without really defining them, kind of leaving the public in a state of confusion and fear. In this clip, you heard McCarthy speaking at a committee meeting and claiming that there was a threat from, quote, infiltration in various defense offices, including the CIA earlier in that meeting and atomic hydrogen bomb pilots in the clip. But let me ask you, what does infiltration mean? It certainly sounds bad, and the dictionary definition agrees, saying it's, getting access to cause damage or steal secrets. But was this what McCarthy was talking about? Did he have evidence of this? Or was it actually government employees and later other prominent citizens who went to work and did their jobs, and maybe back in college or something like that, they went to some meetings? This is obfuscation in action. McCarthy isn't just using complex language, he's weaponizing words to kind of create that atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. His tactics made it really difficult for average people to separate fact from fiction, effectively just muddying the waters. So we'll fast forward to today, and while the specific issues might have changed, the challenge is still around. Let's examine a couple of hypothetical examples to see how this might play out. Imagine you're watching a debate on healthcare reform, and a candidate declares, we need to implement a market-based approach to healthcare that empowers consumers and promotes competition. That sounds good on the surface, doesn't it? But let's dig deeper. What does a market-based approach actually mean? Does it mean they want a single-payer system? Does it mean they want universal health insurance? Does it mean they want something else entirely? The statement is vague, and the vagueness of that statement lets the candidate appeal to a broad audience without committing to any specific policy, hiding their real opinions. Here's another example. How about a news article discussing a tax bill? And the piece might claim that the bill will, quote, simplify the tax code and, quote, reduce the deficit. Again, these are positive sounding phrases that most people would support. But what do they actually mean in practice? There are always winners and losers, and less money means less services. So who's really going to benefit from these changes, and who's going to be hurt by it? The article is using obfuscating language in order to gloss over the downsides of the proposed legislation. And honestly, when journalists just write it down, when a candidate says things like this without pressing them, they are really not doing a service to you as the audience. Political advertising can be another fertile ground for obfuscation. We've seen campaign ads featuring candidates promising they're going to, quote, make America great again, or, quote, build a bridge to the 21st century. These slogans are like masterclasses in vagueness. They kind of bring up these powerful emotions and the nostalgia without offering any concrete policy proposals or any solutions to real problems that the country's having. So, what do we do about obfuscation in political discourse? Here's a couple of strategies. Number one, when a newsmaker says something, always think about asking questions, looking for that context and that evidence. If the journalist doesn't provide it, maybe if there's a space for a comment, add that in a comment. I don't know what this means. Why aren't you explaining this? Number two, look out for emotional manipulation. Politicians often will use fear or anger or nostalgia to kind of distract and keep them from having to address substantive issues, particularly if they're having to take a side is going to make them unpopular with some people. And if you get a chance to actually talk to politicians, if they're using vague language or making sweeping promises, ask them for details. If you get to go ask a question at a town hall meeting, make them explain themselves. What specific policies are they proposing? How do they plan to implement these big ideas? I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, you'll hear my uninterrupted conversation with Lee Raine, director of the Imagining the Digital Future Center, about generative AI and its potential to really complicate elections. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Lee Raine directs the Imagining the Digital Future Center. Before that, he founded and served as the director of Internet and Technology Research at the nonprofit and nonpartisan Pew Research Center. Lee, welcome to Unspun. When it comes to the Imagining the Digital Future Center, what are you hoping to accomplish with it?
We're hoping, first of all, to continue a long-standing line of research that we think has produced a lot of valuable findings. When we asked experts about what was going to happen in the future of the internet, ours was some of the earliest work that basically said the transition to mobile connectivity is going to be thorough and complete and dramatic. They were among the first to predict the rise of hate groups online, the first to talk about the diminishing and now invisible boundary between work and home and leisure and school. And so we just literally being able to make those kind of predictions, that the track record is pretty good for accuracy, but also just really to start conversations about what's on the horizon. I mean, one of the nice things about experts is for them, it's not a horizon. It's what they're working on at the moment or what they know is being worked on. So we had a pretty good grip on the phenomena that were going to be occurring. And in many cases, we were well ahead of public awareness of things, in some cases, policymaker awareness of things. So we're hoping, first and foremost, to raise interesting questions about what's ahead, to drive conversation about it, and to sometimes, if lightning strikes, to have policymakers begin to think about things before they become urgent. So we're hoping that it's useful information that gives people a roadmap for the future in all sorts of contexts.
Okay. And I know that artificial intelligence, or AI, has been one of the kind of early focuses for the center, and that one of the first ones was actually integrating AI into higher education. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes to the 6 principles about a broad variety of organizations and institutions all over the world signing on to. And I just wanted to ask about a couple of the principles that were in there. The first one mentions people being the center and not the technology. So what does that mean and why is that important?
The striking thing to a lot of people about the rise of artificial intelligence is that it's a new kind of tool, even different in some key respects from the internet itself. And God knows, fire, hammers, steam engines, electricity, the tools that we've, as humans, have created in the past have enhanced human physical capacities. They've made us stronger. They've made us faster. They've made us wiser in some respects, but it's by assembling things and putting them together and then having us be the final arbiter of what's going on. This is the first tool that now moves into the realm of our minds, of our cognition, of our consciousness, the sort of secret distinguishing thing about humans from other species. And so there are ways in which now we're going to have to make incredibly profound adjustments to tools now that show intelligence greater than ours in some respects, that look like they're thinking, that look like they're reasoning, that look like they can interpret what we want and need and what's going on in the world. And so there's a pretty palpable sense that humans might get supplanted. Some people have used the line, humans will become obsolete in the long-term future. So the first principle that we articulated was, we don't think that's such a good idea. Humans have brought some problems to the planet, but more often than not, humans can figure out how to make things better and figure out how to fix problems, and that their consciousness, their capacity to commune in sort of important and transcendent ways, humans remaining in charge of things, first of all, gives us a sense of control. If we hand over control to something else, that just feels disorienting and potentially menacing. So humans in charge of it, we know what we can do when we put our minds together to do the right thing. And I think one of the freaky things about artificial intelligence to everybody is that when it looks like it's got human-like or even superhuman-like capacities, we're going to get left behind. And for now, at least, we're thinking that humans run this stuff, watch what's going on, stress test some of the problems, try to address problems before they become ubiquitous and things like that. That's a good thing.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that, in my fields of education and journalism in particular, where people are seeing the tool and thinking, well, we can use the tool to replace humans. And sometimes we have to rethink what we're doing in a lot of different ways. But anyway, I will go on. So another one of the principles deals with the idea of digital inclusion. And so I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about what that means, and in particular, how social leaders like universities might actually pay attention to that.
One of the really striking things about studying AI right now is that I'm comparing it with studying the early internet. And in the early days of the internet in the 1990s, when it became a commercial and widespread phenomenon, certainly in America and then eventually around the world, there was just a very strong consensus of hope and possibility that greeted the rise of the internet. It was going to break down barriers. It was going to allow people to tell their own stories. It was going to enrich culture. It was going to enhance creativity and things like that. So the tone of and people's anticipation of the internet in being embedded in their lives was a hopeful tone and a happy tone. AI is not being greeted by that same phenomenon. And I think part of the reason is because people have seen in the era of social media how things that were hopeful can go really wrong. Giving everybody the chance to say anything they wanted has not necessarily worked out for the best. Letting algorithms curate how people get access to information and having the profit motive sort of at the center of how those algorithms work hasn't necessarily worked out well. So that when I was at the Pew Research Center, we were among the first to start documenting techlash. Maybe 10 years ago, the Snowden revelations that national security officials were using data generated by social media and big tech companies. It was a sort of a wake-up call for how these technologies weren't necessarily used for good purposes all the time, and we're going to always aim to help people get along. So we're starting with, in a sense of AI, that there are externalities and problems to start worrying about, and inclusion is at the center of it. One of the big concerns about the internet that sort of arose during the techlash period of the past decade is that certain people were being able to exploit other people using social media, and the digital divides themselves were a problem. People who were fluent in the use of the internet, especially social media, were, having a good season, and people who were left behind weren't necessarily having access to the technology itself. And even if they had access to the technology, didn't have the best of it and didn't necessarily have confidence that they could use it well. All of that was really worrisome. And of course, during the pandemic, then the sort of stark concerns about kids not being able to access their schools and what that was doing to communities was a big part of it. And some of the earliest of the way the backlash was applied to artificial intelligence was in people highlighting the way it was discriminatory. There are ways in which AI systems, facial recognition starting among them, just didn't treat people equally and actually made catastrophic mistakes in trying to identify people and things like that. So the sense of the importance of inclusion flows out of that the more people who have hands on this stuff at the design stage, or even at the testing stage, or even in the early rollout stage, you're just going to get better results because people do what they do with technologies. They start playing with the features and they see how the thing works for them. They query their name. They start playing with the things and stuff like that. And so immediately there is a feedback loop. If you get more people involved from different perspectives, different, obviously, racial and ethnic backgrounds, but by age, by gender, by educational attainment, by income status, by ruralness and urbanness, by language differences, by religious differences, the more people you have in the design and then implementation of this stuff, the more you're going to not have, stupid and sometimes horrible mistakes made just because the people who should have been in the room weren't in the room. So inclusion in the context of education it starts at the training stage. We obviously believe that new literacies are demanded of this period, knowing how to use the technologies and what they're capable of and where the sort of faults may lie. But also just having a sense that you can't let a bunch of necessarily profit-seeking, monocultural kinds of folks set the tone for what this is. You're much better off by having as many people from as many perspectives as possible, in part because we want to keep humans in control of this.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. So I know that you have a study that came out pretty recently, which was a national poll dealing with AI in elections. And I'll also put a link to the show notes into the results of that poll. I know that from my own work, it's already been a real issue in previous elections. So there's been faked audio phone calls and fake ads and photoshopped mailers and all kinds of things like that, even right here on the local level where I live. And I have to tell you, honestly, I am not really optimistic about the upcoming election because I think AI has really lowered that barrier for creating and spreading that damaging misinformation. And I was really interested to see that most of the people in your poll agreed with me. I think it was 78% said that AI is going to be abused to affect the presidential outcome. Were you surprised by those results?
Yes, and there was a related finding that did surprise me, that so many Americans don't feel themselves competent to detect fakes. Usually Americans are pretty, and lots of people have an optimism gap. They think they're great at stuff. They can figure out what's right and wrong and how to make the right decisions as opposed to the wrong decisions. And they think other people are a mess. So it's I'm okay, everybody else is screwed up kind of dynamic. And so that's a big part of this. But the larger result, I think, speaks to a couple of things, actually. It's first of all, it's just confusion about AI itself and the sense that the manipulative properties or the enabling manipulation that it allows people is just amplified unimaginably. In 2016 and 2020, when the Russian research agency wanted to sort of drive Americans against each other, humans were creating the content that stoked people's anger, and they tested which ones were the most incendiary and which drew the most engagement and stuff like that. Now you can just have a machine generate literally countless versions of that stuff and pump it into the system and figure out which ones work and which ones don't. And you keep iterating and iterating and iterating, again, at the level of orders of magnitude more than human-created misinformation. So the part of that is Americans having a sense that AI is a different ballgame. It puts everything on steroids. The other thing, of course, that's been a long-term concern since the beginning of the millennium is that the Americans are increasingly despairing of just political culture, political communication, political life. They think everybody's a mess. They think the system is corrupt. They have so little trust in the institution. This is just another piece of that. And part of what they're telling us in the answer to that question is we hate politics the way that it's conducted now. And this can't do anything but make it worse.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I thought was really interesting was that, although Americans had that pretty dour view, it didn't seem like it was based in a whole lot of personal knowledge or experience. I suspect a lot of the people who completed your survey didn't actually know when they were interacting with AI in all of the different parts of their lives. But fewer than a quarter of them said they had used some of those new tools, like a Chat GPT even. And a majority even said they had only heard a little bit about AI. I wonder how much the lack of familiarity is affecting the attitudes that people have. Do you think they would feel better if they had tried it?
Some would, and some wouldn't. One of the most interesting things that we've seen as people react to AI is that different applications draw different reactions. Obviously, familiarity gives you a sort of more informed answer, but one of the sort of virtues, I think, of measuring people, even at the low awareness stage or even lack of awareness stage, is you're getting a good reading on their disposition, their values, how eventually they're going to react once they do begin to encounter these technologies or begin to be aware that they're encountering them. So it's a really valuable reminder that not everybody's living the high life of using these chatbots extensively and using them in every dimension of their professional and personal lives. So that part of it is going on as well. And I think it'll be a really interesting process to watch how people change as their awareness grows and as this technology becomes normalized in their lives. I mean, one of the really brand new things that's happened to the AI compared with other technologies is it's being built into our ubiquitous systems now. I mean, whether you care to or not, when you're writing an email in Outlook or in Gmail or whatever, you're now have a little button that allows AI to assist you if you feel like it. If you're writing a document, now you've got a little AI bug there, or it even sort of intervenes at will to sort of say, you should think about writing this differently, or you should think about including this information before you get to this next stuff. So it's being in some ways sort of force fed into the culture that is still trying to grapple with what it is and what it means and how to deal with it and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see. The internet wasn't force-fed that way. I mean, there was a very familiar dynamic of early adopters and then early majority adopters and late majority adopters that just, long been documented when innovation is introduced to populations. This is so different because it's literally being thrust into our lives, whether we want it or not, and opting out takes a lot of work. And in some cases, you kind of want to kick the tires to see what it's like anyway. So watching how this rolls out is going to be almost a brand new thing in a pretty important domain of scholarship of how innovation makes its way into populations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fact that it's kind of hidden in some of the things that you use is really, really interesting. I mean, there's other stuff that's been hidden too, right? Like search algorithms and those kind of things. But this one is, it seems special in some ways. It kind of takes over your voice.
I think the whole process of normalization is affected by this, and people might even get to a point 5 years from now where they had a vague notion that something called artificial intelligence was rolling out into the world. They're using it pretty constantly and don't even know it. I mean, one of the big challenges we eventually got to as we were trying to measure internet adoption was that people didn't know they were using the internet when they were, for instance, sending emails, or they didn't know they were using it in the internet in countries where Facebook was providing it for free. They said, yes, I use Facebook, but they didn't have a sense that the internet was the underlying platform that they were using. And so I think in some ways that requires the scholarly community to be thinking hard about how we even measure usage and acceptance or non-acceptance in an environment where the mystery is pretty strong.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the other things that I thought was super interesting was the partisan divide that you uncovered. So your respondents who identified themselves as Republicans were more likely to expect that AI-generated content was biased against conservatives. And I want to think a little bit about why that might be. And I guess I'm wondering if sometimes leading sort of conservative thought leaders will repeat a message, right, that conservative views are being stifled or being suppressed in some way by big tech. Do you think it's that, or do you think there's something else going on here?
I for sure think it's that. I mean, coming out of the social media era, that was a very strong early indication of partisan divisions on this. So for a long time, tech and tech companies were sort of pre-partisan. There wasn't any sort of partisan inflected view on whether they work or not. But certainly starting 2015, 16, and in the Trump era, there was a sense that the platforms were biased in their content moderation policies and their decisions about who was platformed or not weren't friendly to conservatives. That's carried over. So I think your presumption is really right about that. The other thing that I think increasingly is the issue is that conservative media are very quick to highlight examples of when these tools have been queried to give answers on political and social questions, and there are well-developed measurement schemes about whether answers and sentiments skew right or left. And some of the earliest tests, and some of them showed that some of the standard answers from the language models were a little bit more liberal. And then, evidence of that gets quickly propagated by the conservative media industrial complex to a degree of awareness in that world, I think, that doesn't exist in sort of center-left world. So I think that's partly going on too. So it's a holdover from the social media era that's sort of getting amped up in a new way in the AI era.
Yeah, and so that kind of brings me back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier. As a communications professor, one of the things that we study is something called the third person effect, right? And this is where people assume that the media affects everybody else, but it doesn't affect me, right? The I'm smarter than that effect. And you found a beautiful example of this in your study, with your respondents so much more confident in their own ability to detect fake photos and videos and audio than most voters. One thing I wanted to ask, the people that you polled, you didn't limit that to registered voters or likely voters or actual voters or anything like that, right? It was just people, not political sorting.
Exactly. It was all respondents, but we can cut it that way. And the registered voters weren't particularly different from the general population. The likely voters were somewhat different in being more confident. I mean, partly because they're more partisan, partly because they have such dismissive views about the other side that they want to. But by saying yes, I get it is another way that they can say, and I hate those other people who are idiots that are part of it. So it's a soup of attitudes that is not just directly related to AI, but sort of AI gets roped into this long-standing phenomenon that I'm okay, you're not, and this optimism that people have about their own capacities and pessimism they have about others. Yeah, and even when we asked it in earlier kinds of surveys about job loss, people thought other jobs were going to get hammered, but they are so uniquely important and valuable to their employers, no matter what job they held. It held across job categories. I'll survive the carnage was a very common answer compared with everybody else is going to get hammered.
Really interesting. I know that your respondents felt that most voters would not be able to detect manipulated information. And it makes me think about why that matters, right? So it seems to me there's a couple of possible implications. So if people think that they're a lot better. They'd have less incentive to try to learn like the new skills to detect manipulated information could be one. But, here's another. You asked how confident people were in terms of how fair the upcoming presidential election was going to be. And I feel like your answer was similar to what I've seen in other recent polls. About 60% of respondents said they were confident in the upcoming election, which means, 40% didn't know or were not, which is a little scary. I wonder if people believe these gullible other voters exist. And I wonder if that kind of adds to that feeling that the upcoming vote is not going to be fair. I know that, you personally and the centers you've worked with, you've been speaking to experts in network technology for, decades now. What do they see as the threats to elections from these kind of beliefs?
Well, it starts with fake information. They think there is going to be convincing, air quotes, evidence that proves the horrors that the other side has perpetrated in the election administration process and the vote counting process. And so that's one dimension of it. The other thing that people are thinking there, it's actually longstanding partisanship that just obviously now applies to not only the election itself, but the aftermath of the election. I mean, a lot of people are predicting that this is going to be the most litigious aftermath of an election, partly by sort of manipulated images or suggested problems with the election administration and stuff like that. So I think there's just a sense that nobody is above suspicion is the sort of broad view, and that everybody's going to play for their team the way the most potent and important and powerful way they can, whether that's inside the rules or not inside the rules. And so the longer term thing that I think maybe you're suggesting that I think is, the most dangerous part is this increasing dissipation of social trust itself. Politics is a very important domain in which people, have to abide by election outcomes and think that others are well-meaning and think that the political system will eventually, meet their needs and things like that. But this sort of broader underlay, this is a foundation of certainly of democracy, is you got to think that other people have a wisdom to them, and that certainly collective wisdom eventually prevails, or that your side's going to have its chance with the levers of power and things like that. And I think there's now so much distrust just endemic and built into the process, and it's very tied to institutional distrust that's also playing out in this answer, that we don't think the election outcome is going to be the legitimate one, and we're going to fight to the finish with every tool we have at our disposal, some of them legal, some of them extra legal, for our team to win.
Yeah. No, it almost seems like, that's kind of a legacy of the disinformation in the 2016 election, right? Intended at undermining that social trust. And I got to say, I started by saying I was not optimistic, and this is not helping, but that's okay.
But that I think you've taught me, among others, is that information war itself is an asymmetric battlefield. If I don't have well-meaning motives and I haven't bought into the system and I don't think, well of my fellow citizens, using any tool at my disposal seems a legitimate and important thing to do. And in the context of information war, I don't have to win over my enemies. I don't even have to win over undecided voters to my side, to my point of view. All I have to do is sow enough doubt that they'll probably not vote, which is, a win for my side, or that they'll just think ill of everybody in the process. So my crimes and misdemeanors don't get counted any more severely than whatever, everybody assumes everybody's playing with the system and manipulating it and turning it to its advantage, and sometimes doing it in, non-legal ways. That's the victory. And so, the people who are playing kind of by the old noble idealistic rules of democracy, which is, I should win arguments. I should prevail in a conversation. I should convince somebody that I've got a legitimate point of view that is worthy and has, deep meaning and values baked into it. That's not the landscape we're in now in the information ecosystem of politics.
Yeah. Okay, final question. Is this, I know your survey was of U.S. Citizens, is this a U.S. issue or is this a global issue?
Well, as you know, this is the Super Bowl of democracy this year. There are more people voting in democratic elections around the world than at any point in human history. And so, by November, we will have had the Indian elections, where this is just a dynamic that's playing out. We will have the snap election in Britain and a whole bunch of other places. And so there are ways in which we're going to be the tail end of the whatever learnings have been occurring through the remainder of the year. And for researchers, we got to watch this and see how it plays out and try to speak to it. And sort of democracy, thumbs up or thumbs down, feels like it's on the ballot in a whole bunch of countries, not least of which is America. And darn it, that's not the way things have played out, particularly in the post-war period, for most of the time. And it does absolutely feel like an existential question about whether the mechanisms of democracy, which have held up pretty nicely in our country, survive this really big challenge.
All right. Well, Lee Raine, thank you so much for coming with me on Unspun this week. And I look forward to seeing more from the center.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.